You're listening to the Weekend Sport Podcast with Jason Pine from News Talk ZB.
News Talk ZB and Weekend Sport. New Zealand Rugby is in the throes of negotiating their next broadcast deal. It's been reported Sky TV's offering $85 million a year for the domestic rugby rights from 2026 to 2030. That includes All Blacks Tests and Super Rugby Pacific matches, well below the existing $111 million annual deal, which expires at the end of the year. That deal signed before the last Rugby World Cup, in fact before the 2019 Rugby World Cup, when Spark Sport was in the market and chasing broadcast rights for live sport. That is, of course, no longer the case. Let's bring in Hamish McLennan, former chair of Rugby Australia, chairman of digital advertising company REA Group and ARN Australia, hugely experienced media and marketing executive with an unrivalled understanding of the changing media landscape as it relates to sport. Hamish, thanks for lending us your expertise. In general terms, first of all, how important are broadcast deals for the overall health of a sports organisation like New Zealand Rugby?
Oh, it's probably the central pillar in terms of how you drive the game beyond, pathways and grassroots, because that is the platform and the vehicle in which you promote the game. And if I look at where rugby in Australia stumbled, they did an exclusive deal with a pay TV provider in Australia, and for 20 years it was behind the paywall. And so the challenge is you want some free-to-air exposure, in my opinion. And if you look at the competitive landscape here, the AFL and the NRL had probably 40% of their coverage on free-to-air. And so participation, awareness, creating personalities out of the game really drove the popularity of those sports, where rugby probably suffered a little bit. So it's something that New Zealand have to consider.
In fact, that is the key thrust, I think, to the entire conversation is the free-to-air part of it, because at the moment, as you know, very little, if any, of the top rugby is free-to-air over here. How robust are those conversations when pay-per-view broadcasters probably don't want any content available on free-to-air?
Well, New Zealand's a bit different to Australia. So we have a law called the anti-siphoning law. So premium Tier 1 sports have to show, certainly like our tests, are on free-to-air, but the rest can sit behind a paywall. So for New Zealand, do you take the money, or do you try and ensure that you reach the maximum amount of viewers? Now, sort of rugby in New Zealand is different, because it is the sport where Australia has Sydney has the most competitive winter sports market in the world, if you include soccer. So I personally think some free-to-air exposure is important, but you're faced with NZR. You've got to fund the organisation. Plus, they brought a very credible private equity firm, Silver Lake, in as a part owner of the sport, and they've probably promised them an uplift in revenue. And ultimately, they want to get a return on their capital.
So what then do you perceive those conversations around the table to be like? Because you're so right. I mean, not everybody has access to pay-per-view sport. And, many of us grew up, connecting with the sports we love by watching them on TV. If that's not available to young people, then I'm not sure what the future looks like. What do the conversations around that table generally look like?
Look, I think private equity typically will work to a 5 to 10 year horizon, and the administrators of rugby in New Zealand have to take a 20-year view. So the challenge for them is how do they balance the two? And the conundrum they've got is that Sky is really the dominant platform in New Zealand, and with any media right negotiation, you need to have competitive tension. So in Australia, we have more, just because of our scale, more media organisations that contest those sporting rights. So if there's no competitive tension for Sky, they'll try and drive the price down. Even though, the All Blacks and sort of rugby is the premium sport on that platform, but they've got a business to run, and a subscription TV around the world is under pressure, because you've got all the tech giants getting into streaming. And you might have heard that Foxtel in Australia just got sold to an overseas streaming platform called DAZN or DAZN.
Yes.
So it's changing. It's changing rapidly. But the issue is, can Mark Robinson bring in a competitor like DAZN to provide that tension to try and keep the value of the rights up high?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what happened last time with Spark Sport, the now defunct Spark Sport. They were chasing, live sport rights, got the 2019 Rugby World Cup, and so there was a genuine competitive tension. When there is only one genuine bidder, how much different do the negotiations become?
Oh, they're much more difficult. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So, in blunt terms, if you've got two or three competing for a property, that's going to be a better bidding environment. But if there's only one platform, if you can save $20 million on the value of the media rights in New Zealand, that goes straight to your bottom line. And if you're a CEO or a board, you've got shareholders, and you look good if you can do it. But you also don't want to destroy the value of the game. And what I was dealing with when I was at rugby in Australia was, there are a whole lot of legacy issues, and I don't want to sound defensive, but as your revenue declines, and broadcast rights are one of the few levers that you can pull that if you get it right, you can drive incredible value in terms of awareness and obviously money. But then if your revenue is going south, then you got less to put into grassroots or pay the top players. So, over the decades, we've lost in Australia a lot of really good players overseas. And so if you're competing against French and English and Japanese clubs who are paying top dollar and you don't have that money in the kitty, then it's going to be very challenging.
Indeed. The streaming side of things, do you perceive that will be something that happens more and more in the short term, or are we more likely to see the likes of a traditional broadcaster like Sky Sport continue to have the rights to rugby here?
So, Facebook are wading into, various sports around the world, and you're going to... It's very hard for the traditional players to compete against the tech platforms because they've just got a completely different model. So it is challenging, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why Foxtel thought that they should, consolidate with DAZN overseas. So in the short term, obviously Sky will do everything to hang on to those key sports, and then as the new entrants come in, the Sporting Code or NZR have to reconcile a new player coming in with the audience that they can deliver. So it's a bit of a Rubik's Cube. It's always hard because if you transition to another player, can they deliver you the same sort of numbers? Because what then sits behind the numbers are the eyeballs, and you've got sponsors who are sort of demanding and wanting growth, and they want to know that they're hitting the maximum amount of people, and you've got as many viewers watching the game so that the sport remains relevant. Again, New Zealand's different because it's not as competitive from a media point of view, and rugby is the number one sport, but they're all things that you've got to consider.
You mentioned the anti-siphoning legislation before in Australia. Does that work well in your view?
So look, that's a great question, and it creates divided opinion, but I think it's actually a good thing because it sort of puts a ring fence around certain premium sports so that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you can get it on free-to-air. And our free-to-air industry in Australia, as challenged as it is incredibly high quality. And so it just means that if you can't afford a subscription to a pay TV service, you get to watch premium sports. And that includes parts of the Olympics and other big events around the world. So there are a lot of people who say to me, look, in a fully competitive environment, you should just make it a free-for-all. And some sports like it because they think they can drive the maximum dollar value for the sport. And there is currency in that argument. I don't deny it. But I'm of the view that I think in some instances the anti-siphoning law is beneficial.
And can you see a time, Hamish, where New Zealand Rugby or any national rugby union takes their broadcasting in-house and sells direct to consumer?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are sports here like supercars, V8 supercars that do it all in-house. Like the tennis in Australia produce it and then they on-sell the broadcast. But if you look at the traditional or the existing model, it's pretty good for the sport because if you negotiate well and you get a good check size, then they do all the production. And so, I think for some sports, ones like rugby where you've got it being played all over the country, you don't have to worry about the production side of it.
It's such a fascinating topic, Hamish. You've lent us some great expertise, lots for our listeners to think about and to chat about. Thank you so much for joining us across New Zealand today.
Cheers, thank you.
For more from Weekend Sport with Jason Pine, listen live to News Talk ZB weekends from midday or follow the podcast on iHeartRadio.